So good time zone, my friends. Hello, everybody. My name is MJ. I'm a podcast academic. I focus on fiction podcasts and audio drama. And today I'll be presenting my thesis project from my master's, Remediating, Remixing, and Recontextualizing New Narrative Strategies in Contemporary Fiction Podcasts, which has a lot of very fancy words for. I noticed that thing happen in fiction podcasts, and I wanted to find out why. So, let me explain to you what a podcast is for the purposes of this presentation, even though I'm pretty sure most of us have an idea. So, podcasts are this really strange zeitgeist. Yeah, like there's this industry that's developed itself around podcasts over the past 20 years since they first came into the cultural consciousness. This is a UK centric statistic, but I feel it tracks with the US and other English speaking countries as well. But the Edison Research podcast metrics for 2024 show that podcast listens are at an all-time high for UK listeners, with 30% of the country having listened to a podcast within the last week and averaging about 47 minutes per day for weekly listeners. So shout out to those weekly listeners. I know we're all like that here. And yet, despite that level of notoriety, there's still a lot of confusion as to what a podcast is exactly. I know the people in the crowd, if you've ever tried to explain why you like podcasts to someone who doesn't really know what we do, you know exactly the feeling. And it's like, no, it's not the chat cast, not the interview. No, I like this other thing, secret third thing. So, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be defining a podcast as follows, based off of Tiziano Bonini's work on the subject. Great guy. Does a lot of stuff on streaming platforms. So, podcast is sound content. So, this medium is entirely in sound, and for the purposes of this study, we'll be limiting our scope only to the audio aspects of podcasting. There's a lot of really cool stuff being done with like websites and descriptions and things like that, but we're not going to go into that. Podcasts are distributed, received, and listened to on demand, so it means that it bends to the audience's schedule. Downloads and platforms where you can get podcasts, podcatchers within the industry are the backbone of the medium, as you can choose when and how much you want to listen to them. And of course, podcasts are produced by traditional editors as well as independent producers, including artists and amateurs. And podcasts are produced by creators of a really wide range of abilities and funding. And the combination of the way that it is largely distributed on the internet and the relatively cheaper equipment lowering the barrier to entry means there's a lot of variety in the content for podcasting. So, a very brief history of fiction podcasts for the people that don't know what this is, and also maybe some new information for you. So, podcast, the word, was officially coined as a term in 2004 by Ben Hammersley in a Guardian article, which was a bit, and then the bit was taken to its furthest extent, as in now there's an industry. But fiction podcasts, according to Ella Watts, was probably had their start in 2005 with the Thrilling Adventure Hour, which is a stage show turned podcast recorded live like radio drama would have been in the 1930s. And a lot of the stuff that was coming out here was anthology type stories, your Twilight Zone-y kind of things. So podcasts with overarching narratives beyond a couple of episodes like in the Thrilling Adventure Hour had not really come into popularity until 2012 with the success of none other than Welcome to Night Vale, of course. To give a bit of perspective on how successful Night Vale still is, in 2022, Rachel Brodsky in the LA Times did a 10-year retrospective, and Night Vale's still receiving millions of downloads per month. So, they're killing it, and we all know this. And following Night Vale, there's a boom of fiction podcasts that followed from 2014 onwards, managing to cultivate a presence at events like the Tribeca Film Festival and establishing conferences like Podcast Movement, PodCon, RIP, as well as establishing, annual awards ceremonies. So look at that, some of my favorites coming in. It was great introducing these to my professors. So all of what makes podcasts unique from other mediums applies to fiction podcasts too, except we can add on another two qualities. Fiction podcasts are made out of scripted or improvised fictional material, they're fictional. So this includes performances like those of a recorded tabletop role-playing game or a series of improv sketches. Something like Hello from the Magic Tavern. And of course, remediation. What fiction podcasts do, and is unique to them, is that they mimic or absorb other mediums. Welcome to Night Vale, for example, is remediating community radio. Okay. What does that mean? What does that mean? So before we can get to remediation, we need to talk about mediation, mediums. And I'm going to talk about Mr. Elephant in the Room, Marshall McLuhan, who described medium as any extension of ourselves resulting from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by any new technology. So an extension of ourselves through new technology. Technology here can be anything from a paperback book to movies to social media and, of course, podcasts. McLuhan also highlights that mediums are determined by the level of engagement audiences put into them. This will make all the people interested in interactivity and podcasts go a little ding-a-ling. Mediums that require passivity and receiving information are hot mediums. Oh, I'm trying to get my laser pointer. There we go. And those that need more active engagement, cold mediums. So, for example, radio falls under hot mediums because traditionally you'd put it on in the background and let it play. But for podcasts that are tightly scripted, edited, curated, as many tend to be now, an argument could really be made for either, as you need to pay attention to an ongoing narrative. Most of it is serialized. Okay, so how about remediation? In 2000, Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin published an extension to McLuhan's work, arguing that mediums, old and new, are constantly borrowing from each other. Remediation is the representation and sometimes the transformation of mediums in other mediums. So, for example, you have books, right? And you have ebook readers, including things like a Kindle or a tablet. Ebook readers have many aspects of a traditional book, but in absorbing those aspects into a new medium, there's new functions. So you have like a table of contents, a page flip, you can annotate, highlight. But then for an ebook reader, there's things like buttons, there's a search function, which you can't do on a paperback book, and you can zoom in and out. Well, you can do that with a real book too, but it's a little easier, I think. So it still, manages to do the same relative experience. And this is why I think remediation is a pretty likely candidate for why fiction podcasts are really happy to blur the lines between hot and cold mediums, as many podcasts are really focused on creating an immersive narrative experience that transports audiences. Instead of listening to a podcast about community radio in a small town, you are the listener of said community radio. You're in Night Vale now. But what exactly is the effect of remediation? Like, what does that do? And what does it change? So this takes us to the big research question here, which is how does remediation shape narrative strategies in contemporary fiction podcasts? There we go. So I propose using narrative strategy as a term, this is an academic term, to have a more specific name for the story of a fiction podcast. This is essentially elements that make up a narrative, like narration, temporality, which is the use of time, perspective, setting, and character. For audio storytelling, that means elements like voice, fading, cutting, mixing, music, all work together to create narrative. And what I'm investigating is how remediation is shown through these aspects of audio and what that means. So a variety of sub-questions will pop up from here. What types of remediation are there? How do you know what kind of remediation is being used? When is remediation being used? And is there a relation between remediation and genre, among many other questions? So to answer these, I used thematic analysis, which I will try my best to explain to you in layman's terms now, to organize a set of 55 fiction podcasts that I could clearly identify as having some form of remediation. I did a lot of listening. So I identified this using the following steps. The first was code labeling. So each data point, which is each podcast, receives a label that succinctly describes what kind of medium it is remediating. And then I organized it by theme. So based on the common labels, I organized them into a theme that described what device or technology is associated with that type of remediation, and then a secondary differentiating word. So, for example, I split up radio shows and radio communications because remediation of a walkie-talkie conversation doesn't necessarily align well with the characteristics of a call-in radio show, although they have the same roots technology. And then I compared the labels and data points with the others under the type of remediation, and then I reorganized as needed. From here, I selected case studies that exemplified certain themes or outliers, although I won't detail those for this presentation, unless you ask very nicely. Okay, so practically this is how that looked. I organized it first by type of remediation on the left, and then by the level of remediation on the right. And for those of you looking at that and squinting your eyes, yes, that is the Kinsey scale, which I made a bit as a meme for my research journal, and then I took it really seriously. So each type of remediation has a list of shared characteristics, the code labels. For example, the radio shows have greetings, name of the station, phone number of the station, segment titles. The museum audio guide podcast would have like details of the art, like title, date, size, description of the artwork, since, they're all made up. Most of them are, at least. And contextual descriptions of the artist. So note that these are not all accurate with their real life counterparts. These are just the kind of vibe of that medium that fiction podcasts have created. For the level of remediation, it goes from exclusively remediating, which means that there's no instances where there was any narration or dialogue without remediation as a framing device, all the way to exclusive audio drama where it has no remediation whatsoever. Okay, a quick look at my findings. So, number 1, remediation comes in waves. Number 2, the possibilities in audio storytelling using remediation is very diverse. I'm sure y'all know that. And number 3, remediation needs flexibility from the creators in order to sustain the podcast for significant amounts of time. So I'm going to break these down based on data analysis, and then I'll be playing some audio clips from our beloved Wolf 359 to demonstrate what it sounds like and give you a better idea of what I mean. So firstly, remediation comes in waves of popularity of about 2 to 3 years. You can see this in a visual of the timeline from 2011 to 2014. The odd time frame is because the first data point, the No Sleep podcast, was the earliest instance of this kind of remediation I could find. And I also wanted to explore the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown years on remediation, since I noticed that a lot of them, the data points came out in 2020 and 2021. So, laser pointer back to me. As you can see, there is a really, really big spike in 2015, which I think follows quite neatly from the peak of Night Vale's popularity in 2013 to 14. And it dips back down in 2018, which is presumably because of how many shows were attempting to recreate the success of those podcasts released in past years. Lockdown indeed did seem to have an impact on remediation and fiction podcasts. I went back up here. I theorize that this has to do with changes in production methods as shows either pivoted to asynchronous and or remote recording, or they started that with mind when coming up with a premise. And after that period, it seems like we're back to normal levels. So 2024 had the same amount as 2018 did. Secondly, the possibilities in audio storytelling using remediation is really diverse. So here's the distribution for the different types I've identified. The top 3 most common types of remediation framing devices, you could say, in our personal audio recordings, radio shows, and non-fiction podcasts. But there's a really wide array of types of remediation beyond that. 84% of the types are what can be called audio-to-audio remediation, wherein another audio medium is being translated into podcasts. The rest are a mixture of text-to-audio or visual-to-audio remediation. Radio takes up 18%, presumably utilizing the long history of radio and its various formats, which includes community radio, pirate radio, music radio, call-in shows, all that jazz. There are a lot of instances of phone call remediation, although more voicemails than anything else, which I think is really interesting because that doesn't really happen in any other kind of audio medium. And there's also a surprising amount of museum audio guide podcasts, especially after the show Within the Wires season 2 specifically seemed to popularize it with its really positive critical reception in 2016. Love you, Roy Mata Mangakahia. Since then, there's been at least one of these released every 2 years, which I think is really cool. Keep making more of them. I love it. The nonfiction podcast is an instance of auto-remediation, as a podcast is remediating itself, just into a different subgenre. This is observed to be done to make it seem like the story is happening in real life, which can work really well with podcasts that have science fiction or horror elements, which is, as we know, most of them. So, for example, that does this. Sure, that does this. Everything is Alive is a alternative fiction podcast. Is that conducts interviews with inanimate objects, and it's edited and recorded like a real interview show with experienced improv actors that respond really seriously. So they are that toothbrush or that grade of sand, and that makes it has a good sense of humor and comedy due to the really absurd premise. And finally, remediation and fiction podcasts really, really prefer flexibility. So this might seem contrary to the chart here, as most fiction podcasts that remediate are exclusively remediating, but there is a sizable section with more audio drama elements. This is because fiction podcasts of a longer runtime tend not to use remediation to completion, so a lot of the exclusively remediating podcasts seem to be shorter overall. I've observed 3 outcomes based on this. The first is the podcast continues to remediate, but the narrative becomes really constricted as a result. The second is podcast changes context around remediation to recreate that same effect, so they can keep using it. Or 3, it just becomes more like or a complete audio drama, and they just drop the remediation completely. Oh, are we excited to hear our friends from the Hephaestus station? I will be playing some clips from Wall 359. For those that don't know, go listen to it right now. It's one of my first ones ever, one of my favorites. The podcast is about a group of people on the space station USS Hephaestus orbiting the titular star to survey for signs of alien life. It began exclusively remediating radiolog type recordings that the protagonist Doug Eiffel would produce to keep track of what data he's gathered. What the audience quickly finds is that he's not actually very dedicated to his job at all. Here we go. Hopefully that works. If not, we'll all read together.
The operation is still in its opening stages as well. In any case, this is the log of Communications Officer Douglas Eiffel speaking from the USS Hephaestus station. It's day 455 of our orbit, looking forward to another calm one around Red Dwarf Wolf 359. Yep. Super calm, totally uneventful day, smooth sailing.
Eiffel, you insubordinate hyena. This is outrageous even by your ridiculously low standards. How do you even expect to get away?
Oh, Minkowski. All right, so let's do some analysis. Within this, you can see that there's 2 types of remediation, the personal audio log and radio communication. So bolded here is Eiffel's introduction, which gives us the setting and a narrative justification for why the audience can listen in. The events all occur within the audio log. We helpfully get this exact same introduction for the beginning of each episode, which establishes where we are in the narrative so far, which day we're in. And it also has the function of greeting the listener with a familiar spiel. It's like an intro. To introduce us to other characters, the podcast also uses radio communication remediation. This is indicated by the buzzer sound and the fuzzier, tinier quality from the other side. As Minkowski, the captain of the ship, is tuned out by Eiffel, and we get a really, really quick idea of what their relationship to each other is. So, using remediation, we immediately have an idea of all of that in such a short span of time. And 1 season in, though, it became clear that I think the creators that were restricting themselves to only audio logs was kind of unsustainable. So then they started experimenting, and this is part of why I love this show.
Find cooler names.
No, Eiffel. No. There we go. So here's one way that they used remediation to depict temporality. In this clip, Eiffel is stranded on a ship and having to continuously freeze himself into a stasis pod to survive. Sorry for the spoilers, the show's been out for years now.
Mayday. This is Officer Eiffel on board the USS. I've been stranded on board an operational vessel for 89 days. I require...
Oh, he's going through a rough time. Okay, so the creators Gabriel Urbina and Sarah Shekin call this radio montage, as the overlapping dialogue and sound effects create a feeling of the passage of time, as if the events the audience is listening to are bleeding together. And through the form of a distress signal, Eiffel repeats his Mayday transmission, which punctuates each new audio clip as the audience becomes aware of how long he's been in space for. And this is facilitated by the remediation of radio communications once again, giving narrative justification as well as a practical and creative way to achieve certain effects. And because of World 359's ability to shift away from exclusive remediation depending on their narrative needs, it managed to last for 61 beautiful episodes from 2015 to 2018. And it maintains a cult following to this day. Hello, I'm cult following. The same can be said for Welcome to Night Vale, which is 250 episodes plus strong. And everything is live, also branched out to like pairs of objects and even animals. So I think that it's fair to say that fiction podcasts with remediation can only maintain longevity with flexibility. And it played again. Hello, sorry for the jump scare. Love technology. So, in conclusion, countless fiction podcasts have come out since then, all reacting to each other and positioning themselves within the canon of modern audio storytelling. And remediation is a restriction that breeds creativity. In the future, I expect to see increasingly sophisticated uses of remediation as it continues to saturate the market, although I think it needs more attention and critical discourse to develop further. So keep talking about podcasts and analyze them, get really deep into them. I find it interesting that there are certain things that are culturally associated with certain mediums, which begs the question of if audio storytelling can really be audio only, or if they can not rely on remediation at all. Like, podcasts challenge the idea of medium, and yet they seem firmly entrenched in it. So how does storytelling work in nonfiction podcasts, and are there instances of remediation there too? Hint, there are. I've started that research already. What kinds of narrative strategies do nonfiction podcasts employ? And just in general, like, how do we talk about the audio medium? You know, I think a lot of us find ourselves using words that are related to visual media, despite it being an audio medium. So maybe it's time to standardize that language or start figuring that out. If there's any takeaway I'd like for you to have from this presentation, and this will be no problem for you guys at all, go listen to a fiction podcast, you know? And keep looking through, podcast recommendation newsletters, give it to each other, and, read stuff like the Ear Candy Archive, which I run, which I'm going to put up QR codes for in a second. And don't take my word for it, give it a listen and try reframing your thinking around like how framing devices work with remediation. And thank you so much. Here's my bibliography. Once again, feel free to take a screenshot, and I can provide any of these texts for you if you're curious. And here's some QR codes. I put in Discover Pods because my professors are not the most fiction podcast literate. But also a shout out to the Audio Drama Gazette newsletter, delightful people over there, and my little guy, which is a Notion page, because I haven't finished coding the NeoCities one yet. But I'm open to questions if anyone has anything. Let me see if I can foolishly open the Twitch. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed. What I ended up doing while the stream crashed was talking about Modem Prometheus, because I love that podcast. I think it's great. Everyone go check it out for a really, really cool way to do interconnected storytelling and world building. Because each episode has a mention to the previous... Oh, there's questions coming in. Haha, how exciting. How long did it take for me to make this presentation? The real answer is that it took me a year's worth of research to get this done. Presentation-wise, it was a month of seeing really unimpressed faces from my professors and then taking it to my parents, who are also researchers, to help me fix it up. But yeah, a year's worth of research. And then I'm going to do another 3 when I have my PhD. I plan to research more on immersion in podcasts. I find that really in fiction podcasts specifically, and how that's achieved through soundscaping and sort of and like what narrative immersion means. I find that really interesting because I feel like we're doing a lot in sort of art in general as okay, basically there's lots of stuff that's happening right now, like those projection art things, where it's like an immersive art experience, and immersion is this thing that the art community is just really, really into as a topic. And I find it interesting that a lot of that is just plainly visual. Like, I've been to a lot of these, those like Van Gogh like projection things where it's like we're gonna reintroduce this piece of famous artwork to the masses, and then it's just like cool pictures, and I'm thinking, okay, but where's the music? Sound is something that can go through you and then just exist like in this with you, like where's all that? And of course, I do just want an excuse to do podcasts all the time. My favorite podcast. Oh, that's such a great question. Okay, so this was all done because I really, really love the museum audio guide season of Within the Wires. That was the number one reason why I wanted to do this research, because that came out, and then the Godfrey audio guide came out, and then Misthole Museum. I never get the other M's right, so I'm not going to try. And then I'm forgetting one. It's by Tris Oaten. The Phosphine catalog, that one. Yeah, all of those, love them. So I was just really curious about that, and I had a love-hate relationship with the Black Tape podcast, Black Tapes podcast. Basically, anything that comes out from the I am going to call them Pacific Northwest stories. What are they called now? I don't remember. This is terrible because I write about them a lot. But I'm interested in that kind of framing device type story. And yes, favorite podcast though. That's difficult. I really love Wool 359. I listened to it every day as it came out, coming home from school. If you are on YouTube during the height of Magnus Archive's popularity in lockdown, you might have seen stuff that I've made. So I was really into the Magnus Archives. I met Johnny Sims once. That was cool. Invited him to my university. And then I keep talking about Modern Prometheus. I love that thing. It's so delightful. Basically, anything that I've loved goes into ear candy. So go check that out. I also really like musical podcasts. I talked about them in the panel, but those are super, super fun. Love Rocking Chair. If I could give anyone doing research like this advice, especially when it's for uni, what advice would I give them? Definitely look up very more concrete methods of doing research. That is, I think, your best bet, because I think you can really, really get lost in the weeds of, I really love podcasts and I want to tell people about it, which is exactly what I experienced. But I think that makes it really inaccessible for basically everyone. And you're going to have to face up to the fact that you're going to have to spend a lot of time explaining why this matters and why it's cool to people that don't get it, which I know we already do, but I feel like it's harder in an academic setting because it's like the ivory towers are staring down at you and telling you that you're poo-poo garbage. You don't want that. No one does. I found thematic analysis really useful. Qualitative research methodology, wonderful. it gives you a really like a really strong framework that allows you to go over something many times, so it's like as concrete as something like quantitative research. So I definitely recommend that. And also, I recommend focusing on just one thing for your papers. Just like it can be easy. So I focused on remediation here. I had a year to do that. But if it's, like a couple months for a dissertation, then it's like, okay, something even smaller. Like you want to figure out like how fuzz works in audio, or how like nature sound design works, or like you found one sound effect really crazy and you want to do more with it. I talk about this one a lot. Episode 4, chapter 4 of the first season of the Silt Verses. It is the spooky deer one. Has this sound effect that happens while Carpenter is describing this horrific transformation, and it's so perfect. I love that. I love that sound effect so much, and you can do an entire paper just on that, on how to do visceral sounds. So focus. That's the number one piece of advice that I have. I know it's rich coming from someone who has ADHD, but pot kettle. Okay. I wonder if there's anything else, but I believe if we're all good here, I will skedaddle. Oh, actually, I'm gonna look at the chat first. Yes, musical podcasts are elite. They're so fun. And yeah, academia hates my gay little thoughts too. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to say bye-bye to everybody. Say bye-bye to my little mouse as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And watch out for when this gets published at some point. And I'm going to keep doing more research. I'll give you more fun little graphs to look at, you statistic gremlins. Have a good day.